Debt is supposed to be dangerous. Governments borrow too much, confidence collapses, interest explodes, and eventually everything breaks. That's how the story is usually told, especially when it comes to poor or developing countries. Debt is framed as a warning sign, a countdown clock, a crisis waiting to happen. So when people look at the United States, running massive deficits year after year, piling up debt that dwarfs most economies, the obvious question feels unavoidable. Why hasn't it collapsed? The uncomfortable answer is that the U.S. didn't just survive debt, it weaponized it. The difference between owing money and controlling the system. Most countries borrow in a system they don't control. The United States built the system itself. That distinction changes everything. Debt is only a weakness when someone else sets the rules. When you influence the currency, the markets, the institutions, and the enforcement mechanisms, debt becomes leverage instead of liability. The U.S. understood this early. Instead of treating borrowing as an emergency tool, it made borrowing permanent and designed the global economy to absorb it. The real turning point wasn't the size of U.S. debt, it was the role of the dollar. Once the dollar became the primary currency for global trade, reserves, and pricing, especially for energy, it stopped behaving like a normal national currency. Countries didn't just use dollars to trade with the U.S., they used dollars to trade with each other. That created constant global demand for U.S. currency, which meant constant demand for U.S. debt. Treasury bonds weren't just loans to America, they became the safest parking spot for global capital. Here's the paradox most people miss. When the U.S. borrows, the world often rushes to lend. In times of uncertainty, money doesn't flee American debt, it hides inside it. That behavior flips the usual debt story upside down. Instead of higher debt increasing risk, it often increases demand. Investors, governments, and institutions buy U.S. debt not because America is weak, but because the system treats American debt as stability itself. That feedback loop is power. Debt as a tool of influence. This is where debt stops being economic and starts being geopolitical. Because so much of the world's savings sit inside U.S. financial instruments, American policy choices ripple outward. Interest rate decisions don't just affect American mortgages, they reshape global capital flows. Sanctions don't just block access to U.S. markets, they block access to the system denominated in U.S. currency. Debt ties the world into American financial infrastructure, whether it likes it or not.
Other countries are told to balance budgets, reduce deficits, and avoid excessive borrowing. The U.S. does the opposite and gets away with it. This isn't hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. The rules apply differently at the top. Because American debt underpins global stability, punishing the U.S. for borrowing would mean punishing the system everyone depends on. That gives the United States room no other country has. What would trigger a crisis elsewhere becomes routine in Washington. From the outside, it looks unsustainable. Trillions added, ceilings raised, warnings ignored. But sustainability depends on structure, not optics. As long as the dollar remains central, U.S. debt remains absorbable. Inflation, interest rates, and growth matter, but they matter within a framework that America largely influences. Debt doesn't disappear, but it doesn't behave like a ticking bomb either. It behaves like gravity, always present, rarely questioned, shaping everything around it. The quiet trade-off. There is a cost, but it's not the one people expect. The price of turning debt into power is not collapse, it's dependence. The global system becomes tightly coupled to U.S. decisions. When America sneezes, the world catches a cold. That gives the U.S. influence, but it also gives it responsibility, and that tension sits at the center of modern global economics. Normally, crises expose debt problems. For the United States, crises did the opposite. Every major shock, financial crashes, wars, pandemics, deepened global reliance on U.S. debt instead of undermining it. When fear spreads, investors don't ask who has the least debt, they ask who controls the exit. U.S. Treasury bonds became that exit. Each crisis trained the world to respond the same way: sell risk, buy American debt. Over time, this behavior stopped being a reaction and became instinct. Debt didn't scare markets anymore, it reassured them. Why printing money didn't end the game. One of the most common predictions was that excessive money creation would destroy trust. That logic works in systems where currency demand is optional. In a dollar-centered system, demand is structural. Dollars are needed to serve as debt, buy commodities, settle trade, and stabilize reserves. When the U.S. expanded its balance sheet, it didn't just inject money domestically, it fed global demand. Inflation became a concern, but currency rejection never materialized. The world complained, then adjusted, because there was no alternative with the same scale, liquidity, and trust. Here's the loop that turns debt into power. The world needs dollars to function, so it buys U.S. debt. Buying U.S. debt lowers borrowing costs. Low borrowing costs allow more spending. Spending reinforces economic and military reach. Reach reinforces trust. Trust increases demand for dollars. Once this loop is established, breaking it becomes incredibly difficult without destabilizing everyone involved. That's why even critics of American dominance still hold American debt. Opting out isn't protest, it's self-harm.
Why rivals struggle to replicate it? Other powers have tried to build alternatives: new payment systems, reserve currencies, trade blocs. Progress exists, but scale is missing. Debt power isn't just about issuing bonds, it's about creating instruments the entire world is willing to hold during panic. That requires deep markets, legal predictability, military security, and political continuity. You can't improvise that. The United States didn't flip a switch. It built this over decades, often unintentionally through crises that reinforced its central role. The risk everyone pretends isn't there. This model isn't invincible. Its greatest risk isn't debt size, it's credibility. If trust erodes faster than alternatives develop, the system weakens. But credibility erosion is slow, uneven, and difficult to coordinate globally. That's why predictions of sudden collapse keep failing. Change, if it comes, will likely look like drift rather than rupture. Power doesn't vanish overnight, it leaks. One of the strangest outcomes of this system is how normal debt feels inside the United States. For most countries, debt creates immediate fear. Budgets tighten, spending freezes, politics turn defensive. In the U.S., debt barely changes daily life. That's not because the numbers are small, but because the consequences are delayed, exported, or diffused globally. When borrowing costs rise, the impact doesn't stay inside American borders. Capital shifts, exchange rates move, other economies adjust. Debt feels abstract at home because its weight is distributed abroad. Exporting pressure without exporting control. This is where debt turns from economic tool to structural advantage. When the U.S. runs deficits, it absorbs global savings. That reduces capital available elsewhere, raising borrowing costs for other nations while keeping American financing relatively cheap. The pressure isn't announced, it isn't framed as policy. It just happens. Countries don't lose power because the U.S. demands it. They lose room to maneuver because the system reallocates resources towards American assets. That quiet reallocation is far more effective than overt coercion. Poor and middle-income countries are often forced into austerity when debt rises. Cut spending, raise taxes, slow growth. The U.S. never accepted that logic because it never had to. Austerity is imposed by creditors. When you are the system's safest borrower, creditors compete for access instead of enforcing discipline. This flips the moral narrative completely. Debt stops being a sign of irresponsibility and becomes proof of centrality.
The more the world needs stability, the more it tolerates American borrowing.
Military power and debt reinforced each other. Debt power didn't exist in isolation. It was reinforced by security guarantees, alliances, and military reach. Countries holding U.S. debt weren't just betting on financial returns, they were betting on geopolitical continuity. American security commitments reduced perceived risk, which lowered borrowing costs, which enabled more spending, which sustained that same security architecture. This feedback loop linked finance and force so tightly that separating them became impossible. Debt wasn't funding weakness, it was underwriting dominance. The United States didn't turn debt into power by accident, but it didn't design it in a single moment either. It emerged from history, crises, and structural advantage stacking on itself. Understanding this doesn't require approval or condemnation, it requires realism. Debt is not inherently weakness or strength. In the right position, under the right system, it becomes leverage. The ending the world quietly lives with. In the end, the most important thing to understand is that the United States didn't defeat debt, it changed what debt meant. For most countries, debt is a promise to behave. For the United States, debt became a promise that the system would continue. That difference reshaped global finance in ways that are so deeply embedded, most people don't even notice them anymore. Debt stopped being a warning sign and became infrastructure. Power is easiest to accept when it feels neutral. The U.S. debt system doesn't announce itself as dominance, it presents itself as stability, liquidity, and safety. When crises hit, the world doesn't rush toward American debt because it loves the United States. It does so because the alternatives are worse. That's the quiet genius of the system. It doesn't need loyalty. It only needs necessity. This doesn't mean the strategy is flawless. Turning debt into power concentrates responsibility as much as influence. When trust wobbles, the consequences ripple everywhere. Inflation, policy mistakes, or political paralysis don't stay domestic, they transmit globally. That's the hidden cost of centrality. The more the world relies on one system, the more fragile everyone becomes if that system missteps. The story of American debt isn't a story about recklessness or brilliance alone. It's a story about position. The United States occupies a role no other country has fully replaced, where borrowing strengthens rather than weakens, and where deficits expand influence instead of triggering collapse. Debt didn't make the U.S. powerful by itself. It became powerful because the world agreed, quietly, repeatedly, and under pressure, to treat it that way. In that agreement, more than any number on a balance sheet, is what keeps the system alive.